Before sci-fi got loud, it used to be lonely. In the 1970s, these films weren't trying to sell action figures or launch franchises. They were slow, quiet warnings, stories about isolation, overreach, and what happens when no one's left to listen. And it starts with a man tending the last plants in space, hoping someone's still out there to care. Silent Running opens like a forgotten dream of Earth. Giant biodomes float through deep space, each one carrying the last remnants of forests, rivers, and wildlife. Back home, the planet has traded nature for artificial climates and synthetic food, but on the Valley Forge, Freeman Lowell still believes in preservation. He gardens barefoot in the soil, he feeds the animals by hand. His crewmates, they just want to go home. So when the order comes to jettison the domes and nuke what's left of nature, Lowell makes a choice. He kills them. It's not out of hatred, it's desperation. Alone with the plants and 3 maintenance drones, Lowell fakes a reactor meltdown and disappears into Saturn's rings. What follows isn't a survival story, it's a mourning. A man trying to keep a forest alive in space, knowing he's the last one who cares. Director Douglas Trumbull had just finished designing effects for 2001, A Space Odyssey, when he made this for just over $1 million. The drones were played by double amputee actors in custom suits, shot inside a converted aircraft carrier with domes built from tennis courts. Universal didn't love it, but over time it became a quiet classic, influencing everything from WALL-E to environmental protest films. It's not action-packed, and that's the point. It doesn't warn you about the future, it just lets you drift into it. But if Silent Running was about isolation in nature, the next film was about erasing nature entirely, starting from the inside out. Takes 1138 takes place in an underground world where silence is policy, emotions are suppressed through medication, and human connection has been replaced with routine. The people live shaved, sedated, and tracked, moving between sterile hallways under the watch of robotic enforcers that some of them help build, including THX himself. His life follows a rhythm of controlled shifts, hollow prayers, and chemical obedience, until LUH, the woman assigned to share his living unit, begins to switch out his daily dose without telling him. What follows isn't a rebellion in any traditional sense, but more like a quiet malfunction, where THX starts to experience unfamiliar reactions that overwhelm his body and draw attention from the surveillance system monitoring his every move. He's soon labeled unstable, separated from LUH, and placed in a white-walled detention space with no visible exit. Eventually, he escapes and climbs toward the surface, a place rumored to be uninhabitable, though no one seems to really know for sure. George Lucas made this film on a tiny budget as his first feature, using real subway tunnels under construction in San Francisco as locations and casting patients from a nearby institution who agreed to shave their heads for a few dollars. The massive white voids were filmed by intentionally overexposing the frame, turning limitations into design choices that made the environment feel less like a set and more like a system with no edges. But over time, it stayed with people, not through shock or action, but because it felt eerily plausible. And if this was a story about identity being erased by force, the next one asked what happens when identity dissolves under the weight of memory itself. Slaughterhouse-Five doesn't build up to anything. It simply states the truth. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. One moment he's in Dresden during the war, the next he's in a suburban living room, then aboard an alien zoo on the planet Tralfamador. Time isn't linear, it's fractured. Billy lives every part of his life at once. Death, birth, marriage, firebombing, none of it in order, none of it avoidable. The center of his trauma is Dresden, where he survives the Allied bombing while locked inside an underground slaughterhouse. When he emerges, the city is gone. The bodies are endless, the world goes on anyway. Director George Roy Hill was given a book many said couldn't be filmed. The novel's absurd tone and nonlinear structure made it a literary anomaly. But Hill leaned into that instability, casting Michael Sachs, then an unknown, and editing the film to mirror Billy's broken memory. The Dresden scenes were filmed in Prague, using local ruins and mannequins to simulate mass death. Kurt Vonnegut, who lived through the real bombing, visited the set and watched in silence. He later called the adaptation flawless. The film didn't become a phenomenon, but it struck deep, especially among Vietnam-era audiences, who had started to suspect that time wasn't the only thing broken. If Slaughterhouse-Five mapped the psychic fallout of war, the next story asked a colder question. What happens when survival itself becomes just another market, where bodies feed systems and systems forget the point of living? Soylent Green is not subtle. It opens in smog, sweat, and overcrowded streets. New York City holds 40 million people, most of them starving. There's no meat, no sunlight, no space. The government rations food through corporate products like Soylent Red and Soylent Yellow. But a new version, Soylent Green, promises hope. It's more nutritious, more efficient, and completely classified. Detective Thorne, played by Charlton Heston, lives with no privacy, no electricity, and no illusions. He's assigned to investigate the murder of a Soylent executive, but what he finds isn't a motive, it's a system. The company controls everything, even the truth. What Soylent Green is actually made from becomes a line so iconic it's been parodied for 50 years. What's forgotten is the buildup, the forced euthanasia centers, the garbage truck body disposals, the silent horror of Edward G. Robinson's death scene, which wasn't acting. Robinson was dying of cancer during filming and passed away just days after production ended. That last scene was the final performance of his career. MGM rushed the film into theaters in May 1973, just weeks after the real-life Soylent Corporation was founded as a food science startup. The name was no coincidence. The idea of eating people was already baked into the culture. And while this story imagined a future of cannibal capitalism, the next one abandoned realism altogether. Because in the ruins of civilization, Zardoz decided the only solution was a flying stone head, a red diaper, and the end of death itself. Zardoz opens with a floating stone head flying over a wasteland. It delivers a message loud, confusing, and impossible to ignore. Inside the head, rifles, manifestos, and Sean Connery dressed in red straps and tall boots. He plays Zed, a killer trained to wipe out anyone living outside a protected zone called the Vortex. Inside the Vortex, a group of elites have figured out how to live forever. They don't age, they don't die, they just exist, stuck in an endless loop of lectures, telepathy, and boredom. Zed sneaks in and slowly disrupts everything, not through war, but by making people remember what it feels like to care about anything at all. Director John Boorman made the film after Deliverance, using budget leftovers from a Lord of the Rings pitch that never happened. Connery joined partly to break away from James Bond, though the costume became one of the most talked about parts of the film. Boorman encouraged the cast to improvise and handed out philosophy books during prep. The result was chaotic and strange, with the ending written during production. Critics didn't know how to handle it, neither did the studio. But over the years, it stuck around, partly because it felt like something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The next film wasn't trying to be symbolic. It was chasing someone across centuries, clocks, and a future that didn't want to happen. Time after time starts with a man politely excusing himself from dinner, then walking into a basement to activate his time machine. The man is H.G. Wells, and the year is 1893. His machine was meant to explore utopia. Instead, it becomes a chase vehicle. Jack the Ripper steals it and vanishes into the future. Wells follows. They land in 1979 San Francisco, a place of neon signs, casual sex, and newspaper headlines full of murder. The twist is simple. Wells believes in progress, but Jack feels at home. He says the future is exactly what he always dreamed of. Wells, overwhelmed by noise and violence, tries to find and stop him. But his real struggle is understanding a century that evolved into something he didn't predict. Faster, freer, and darker. Nicholas Meyer directed the film with a quiet confidence, mixing historical fantasy with thriller pacing. The idea came from a conversation about who Jack the Ripper would be if he lived today. Malcolm McDowell was cast against type as the idealistic Wells, and Mary Steenburgen met him on set. They later married. To recreate 1970s America through the eyes of a Victorian dreamer, Meyer used subtle edits, reaction shots, and off-camera audio to create dissonance. It's not a violent film, but it's unsettling. Because time travel isn't about where you land, it's about who you become when you realize the world doesn't need you. And if that was time slipping sideways, the next film looked down instead into a pit of darkness where gravity itself began to warp. The black hole opens with silence. A tiny probe drifts into space as a massive object looms ahead, pulling light and time into its center. Aboard the USS Palomino, a crew of explorers discovers a derelict ship parked at the edge of the black hole. It's the Cygnus, once presumed lost, now eerily intact. They board it only to find a lone human, Dr. Reinhardt, living among emotionless robot workers and a looming red enforcer named Maximilian. Reinhardt claims the crew left. His story doesn't hold. The ship is a floating mausoleum. The truth is that Reinhardt killed his entire team and converted their bodies into cyborg servants. Now, he plans to pilot the Cygnus directly into the black hole to become something more than human. Disney made this film as their answer to Star Wars, but what they created was stranger. It was their first PG-rated release and their most violent at the time. Maximilian's spinning blades weren't cartoonish, they drew blood. The production used an early computer-controlled camera system to achieve complex moving shots, and the final descent sequence combined practical sets, painted glass, and distorted religious imagery to imply hell, rebirth, or madness, depending on interpretation. The studio didn't know how to market it. The toys flopped, the critics hesitated, but the imagery stayed. Because when you stare into a black hole, the question isn't what's on the other side, it's whether you'd survive meeting it. The next film didn't stare into the abyss, it turned it into television. Buck Rogers in the 25th century doesn't begin with a spaceship, it begins with disco. Buck, a 20th century astronaut, is accidentally frozen during a deep space mission and wakes up 500 years later to a world ruled by robots, holograms, and laser battles. Earth has been rebuilt after nuclear war, and Buck is considered an artifact, a relic of a dumber, messier time. But he's not obsolete, he's unpredictable. He breaks protocol, questions authority, and flirts with every woman in sight. His 20th century instincts become his biggest weapon. Originally planned as a TV pilot, the movie was given a theatrical release after Star Wars exploded. It was Universal's way of testing the waters before committing to a full series. Gil Gerard was cast as Buck for his rugged charm, but behind the scenes he clashed with producers over the tone he wanted the show to be serious. They wanted camp. The tone they landed on was somewhere between Flash Gordon and Charlie's Angels in Space. The costumes leaned into spandex, the soundtrack leaned into funk, and the robot sidekick Tweaky spoke in beeps, voiced by Mel Blanc, the same man behind Bugs Bunny. It ran for 2 seasons before quietly disappearing. But in its own way, Buck outlasted more polished shows, because it never pretended to know the future. It just threw you into it. The next film didn't throw anyone. It replaced them quietly, efficiently, and without warning. Invasion of the Body Snatchers opens with a woman sensing something is wrong. Her husband seems fine, he looks the same, but he's not. In San Francisco, people are changing. They stop laughing. They stop caring. They watch, they wait. Elizabeth and Matthew, co-workers in the city health department, begin to notice subtle shifts in behavior. Then they discover the truth. Alien spores have landed on Earth and are duplicating humans in their sleep, replacing them with emotionless replicas. The city doesn't fall overnight, it erodes in silence. This version, directed by Philip Kaufman, was the second remake of the 1950s sci-fi classic, but it leaned harder into psychological horror. The sound design used pig screams and reversed breathing to create unease. The iconic transformation pods were practical effects made from foam, latex, and real human hair. And Donald Sutherland, who plays Matthew, improvised the film's infamous final shot. His scream was a last-minute choice that turned the ending into one of the most unsettling images in sci-fi history. The film reflected real anxiety, post-Watergate distrust, creeping conformity, the sense that institutions couldn't be trusted. But it wasn't just about paranoia. It was about isolation, the fear that you could lose someone without ever seeing them go. And if this was about watching your world change from the inside, the next film looked up at the sky and wondered what it meant when they came not to conquer, but to communicate. Close Encounters of the Third Kind begins with static on a radio, a pilot's voice cutting in, then cutting off. Strange lights move against the wind, planes vanish, power lines hum. Roy Neary, a utility worker in Indiana, is sent out to check a grid failure. While driving alone at night, something flies overhead. The lights are blinding, his truck vibrates, the air turns still. After that, nothing in his life works the way it's supposed to. He sees shapes, hears tones, obsessively sculpts a mountain he doesn't recognize. Across the country, others experience the same symptoms, visions, sounds, a quiet urgency. They're all being drawn somewhere, without knowing why. The military follows a trail of disappearances and electrical phenomena that leads to a site near Devil's Tower, Wyoming. Something is coming, and it's been planning its arrival for a long time. Spielberg wrote the story from fragments UFO sightings, Cold War paranoia, and an idea about contact without conflict. Francois Truffaut was cast as the scientist, though he barely spoke English. The 5-note motif was developed with a linguist and a composer, designed to function like a handshake. To avoid theatrical violence, the film focused on scale, light, and awe. The final sequence required a soundstage larger than any built at the time. It wasn't the ships that disturbed people, it was what they implied that communication could happen without words, and that control wasn't always on our side. The question stayed long after the film ended. What else is out there, and why are they so quiet now?